Reading the Times for Monday, February 3rd, 2020. SARS stung the global economy. The coronavirus is a greater menace. Ford Motor has told managers in China to work from home while its factories remain idled, said a company spokesman. If customers cannot buy what they need from China, Chinese factories could, in turn, slash orders for imported machinery, components, and raw material, computer chips from Taiwan and South Korea, copper from Chile and Canada, factory equipment from Germany and Italy. China's formidable stature in the world economy means that the impact of the current outbreak is likely to substantially exceed that of SARS. The knock-on effects for the global economy are going to be much larger than they were, said Nicholas R. Lardy, a China expert at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington. Coronavirus pummels Wuhan, a city short of supplies and overwhelmed. Weak with fever, An Jiahua waited in line for several hours outside the hospital in the cold, hoping to get tested for the new coronavirus, which doctors suspected she had contracted. Mr. Long said his father had to go to 6 hospitals and wait several days before he could even be tested for the coronavirus. Without a car, he has not been able to go to one of the designated hospitals to get tested for the coronavirus. Democrats had a 2020 vision. This isn't quite what they expected. From an event space in Newton, where a hand-countable crowd whispered anxieties about Joseph R. Biden Jr., to a union hall in Ottumwa, where the filmmaker Michael Moore filled in for Washington-bound Bernie Sanders, with talk of democratic socialism and Icelandic gender parity. The restless final Iowa days of this endless pre-primary campaign have less resembled a resistance fantasy than a kind of rolling, low-grade anxiety attack for Democrats, but where the final Iowa stretch typically monopolizes national media attention and all but guarantees a major boost for successful candidates, recent days have passed under the cloud cover of impeachment and a global health crisis. The graying of the American economy is on display in Iowa. The nation's older population has grown even faster, and today Iowa is squarely in the middle of the pack when states are ranked by age. One effect of Iowa's aging is that its overall population is growing more slowly than the rest of the country, and according to a recent Iowa State University study, this has become a cyclical problem as new residents are deterred from moving to a state where growth is sluggish. Like half of the states in the U.S., Iowa's white population is shrinking, while its minority population is growing. How a clash of egos became bigger than fixing the subway. Mr. Byford had arrived in New York in January 2018, as Mr. Cuomo was bluntly asserting his XL temperament and political know-how in transit affairs, a first for any governor in the half-century of the MTA's existence, and a direct response to the public's demand that he be held accountable for failing service. Reached last week, Mr. Byford said he was grateful to Mr. Cuomo for bringing him to New York. The work of Mr. Cuomo and Mr. Byford and their relationship mattered far beyond New York. At a casual glance, the MTA, a glued-together bundle of local transit services, some of which date back nearly 200 years, might seem to have little to do with the rest of the country. New U.S. travel ban shuts door on Africa's biggest economy, Nigeria. Chinese, Turkish, Russian, And British firms, backed by their governments, are staking positions on a continent that will define the global economy's future, he said, adding, one hopes that the United States would follow suit and fully engage with the continent, but that hope fades. And Nigeria, it said, posed a risk of harboring terrorists who may seek to enter the United States. With more than 500,000 refugees living outside the country, Eritrea was the ninth largest source of refugees in the world in 2018, according to the United Nations. But fewer than 900 Eritreans received immigrant visas to the United States that year. The United States has left Sudan on a list of state sponsors of terrorism, even as the country works to reverse decades of authoritarian rule under President Umar Hassan al-Bashir, who was deposed in April. Australia's volunteer firefighters are heroes, but are they enough? Most of the fires Michael Blenkins has put out since becoming a volunteer firefighter in the 1980s required little more than rushing to a nearby farm and hosing down ankle-high flames. Its fire brigade has about 30 members, including a half-dozen younger recruits like Edmund Blenkins, who are rare finds in shriveling towns where most firefighters are over 60. The brigade's equipment is also much improved. In mid-January, the gauge showed 88. We are all seeing firsthand the incredible risk of massive fires with their ability to take out cities, thousands of homes, and damn near an entire country, said Frank Lima, vice president with the International Association of Firefighters. In Libya, toothless UN embargo lets foreign states meddle with impunity. It was one of the most shocking episodes of recent fighting in Libya, and the United Nations seemed determined to get to the bottom of it. The United Nations' reluctance to identify or even hint at who was behind the bombing is symptomatic, analysts say, of the weakness of its 9-year-old embargo on Libya, one so widely flouted that the body's envoy to Libya last year said that it risked becoming a cynical joke. Mr. Salameh, the United Nations envoy, warned last year that without action to halt the flow of arms into Libya, the country would descend into a Hobbesian all-against-all state of chaos and eventually be partitioned. Israel puts brakes on West Bank annexation plan. Shortly after last week's rollout of the contentious American Middle East plan, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government made a triumphant promise that the cabinet would vote this weekend to extend Israeli sovereignty over substantial parts of the occupied West Bank. But it looks as though the Israelis misread the signals from Washington. The delay in extending Israeli sovereignty to the occupied territories has exposed Mr. Netanyahu to scrutiny from some right-wing allies, already leery of his embrace of a plan that includes a form of Palestinian statehood, however limited. The breaking point for everything, he said, will be if Israelis proceed with any measures to annex or apply Israeli law or sovereignty to anywhere in the West Bank. Whatever the terminology, it amounts to the same thing. Al-Qaeda claims it directed Florida Naval Base shooting. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula claimed on Sunday that it directed a Saudi military officer to carry out the shooting at a United States military base in Florida in December that killed 3 sailors and wounded 8 people. Mr. al-Rimi, the Al-Qaeda leader, may himself be dead. He was the target of an American drone strike in eastern Yemen last week, according to American and Yemeni officials, who they said believed he had been killed, but were awaiting confirmation. The 21-year-old Saudi Air Force trainee who carried out the Pensacola attack was not a known member of Al-Qaeda. UK police kill a man in terrorist-related incident. The Metropolitan Police said that officers from a proactive counter-terrorism operation quickly responded to the Islamic-related attack and killed the suspect around 2 p.m. local time. The speed with which the police declared a terrorism-related attack on Sunday stood in stark contrast to their announcements after previous attacks, when the authorities took hours or days to say that a terrorist assault had taken place. The assault on Sunday had echoes of the London Bridge attack in November, when Usman Khan, a 28-year-old Muslim man, had served 8 years in prison for his involvement in a plot to bomb the London Stock Exchange, killed 2 people near the bridge. Philippines reports first coronavirus death outside China. Taiwan, which is self-ruled but which China claims is part of its territory, complained on Sunday that it was being punished with flight restrictions because the World Health Organization considers it a part of China. Taiwan has 10 confirmed cases versus more than 14,000 in mainland China, said the foreign minister, Joseph Wu. The number of confirmed cases of coronavirus in Taiwan is not higher than in most countries affected, he said. China has long sought to limit Taiwan's diplomatic relations and recognition of international bodies such as WHO. Taiwan previously participated as an observer at the World Health Assembly, the group's governing body. Scared and panicked, travelers rushed to avoid virus quarantine. Amid canceled flights, tightening global travel restrictions, and looming plans to quarantine Americans returning from China, the tension at a handful of airports still receiving flights from the country mounted on Sunday, as travelers described a scramble for the few remaining tickets out of China, and federal officials ready military bases to house hundreds of people potentially exposed to the deadly coronavirus. Like most passengers, he wore a mask as he walked through the arrivals hall, described an Air China flight across the Pacific, where passengers used copious hand sanitizer. All the flight attendants wore masks, and passengers were deliberately seated with empty seats between them. The airport's direct flight to and from China, a Delta flight to Shanghai, was suspended on Saturday, she said. Wuhan coronavirus looks increasingly like a pandemic, experts say. In the last 3 weeks, the number of lab-confirmed cases has soared from about 50 in China to 14,000 in 23 countries. There have been over 300 deaths, all but one in China. Dr. W. Ian Lipkin, a virus hunter at the Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health, who is at China advising its Center for Disease Control and Prevention, said that although the virus is clearly being transmitted through casual contact, labs are still behind in processing samples. Assuming the virus spreads globally, tourism to and trade with countries besides China may be affected, and the urgency to find ways to halt the virus and prevent deaths will grow. Quieter response to coronavirus in countries where China holds sway. China has been pressuring countries not to ban its travelers, with a Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman calling an entry ban enacted by the United States not in keeping with the facts and not in keeping with friendship. Mr. Hun Sen, the prime minister who has tethered his country closely to China, said he will not ban flights from China. Laos, a secretive socialist nation on the border with China, has also not confirmed any cases, even though a large number of Chinese tourists and workers cycle through the country. Americans demand a rethinking of the Forever War. The invasion is now considered by some historians and national security experts to be the greatest policy disaster of the United States since the Vietnam War. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians and nearly 4,500 American troops killed, trillions of dollars spent, and a destabilized Middle East that both strengthened Iran and gave birth to al-Qaeda in Iraq and its successor, the Islamic State. Proponents of the forever war point to President Barack Obama's withdrawal from Iraq in 2011 as paving the way for the rise of the Islamic State in 2014. That ignores a whole set of circumstances, including the formal withdrawal agreement Mr. Bush has previously reached with the Iraqi government because the Iraqis wanted the Americans out, and the role of the Syrian civil war in creating the Islamic State. Some lawmakers are trying to revoke the war authorizations of 2001 and 2002, the first used for fighting September 11th related terrorism, and the second for invading Iraq, and looking for other ways to constrain Mr. Trump's ability to expand the wars. Art school's merger with Christian University stokes uproar. Asked if students would be censored as artists, Mr. Burns said, "We do work with our faculty and our students to talk about appropriate presentations, but as far as I know, we have never been accused of censoring our student work or our faculty work. We'd be engaged in conversation about how we might modify language in productions or plays, for example, to make them appropriate for audiences." Under the merger, which has been approved by the boards of both institutions, Watkins students will transfer to Belmont's campus in the fall, and Watkins property will be sold to create an endowment to support scholarships for Watkins students. There will be no discrimination against any student for any reason on Belmont's campus, and if anybody does discriminate against any student, they're held accountable for it. Period, Mr. Burns said. Impeachment all but behind him, Trump celebrates and keeps focus on Bloomberg. On many levels, President Trump's weekend, full of golf, catered salmon, and plenty of patriotic-themed evening wear, could have been devised to offer relief and a sense of triumph to a president who spent the first month of an election year watching from the sidelines as the Senate debated his future. During his Fox sit-down, both Mr. Trump and his interviewer seemed more interested in allowing the president to focus on his grievances over impeachment and his re-election effort, rather than elaborate on a global public health crisis. What is President Trump accused of doing? He is accused of pressuring the president of Ukraine to investigate his political rivals, including former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr., a potential Democratic opponent in the 2020 election, in exchange for military aid and access to the White House. Joe Walsh also wants to beat Donald Trump. "I'm a Republican and a conservative, and I'm challenging Trump in the primary," he announced to a Trump supporter festooned in campaign-themed clothing. Mr. Walsh mentioned that President Trump, despite promising fiscal responsibility, had presided over an increase in the federal deficit greater than under President Barack Obama. The turning point for him was Mr. Trump's 2018 meeting in Helsinki with Vladimir V. Putin, the Russian president, in which Mr. Trump said he believed Mr. Putin's claim, contrary to American intelligence, that Russia had not interfered in the 2016 election. Republicans emerging defense. Trump's actions were bad, but not impeachable. With 9 months left in the campaign, Mr. Alexander said he hoped the consequences of Mr. Trump's phone call with Ukraine, becoming the third American president to stand trial for high crimes and misdemeanors, would resonate with the commander-in-chief. Where are we in the process? The Senate is holding a trial to determine whether to acquit President Trump or convict and remove him from office. What is President Trump accused of doing? He's accused of pressuring the president of Ukraine to investigate his political rivals, including former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr., a potential Democratic opponent in the 2020 election, in exchange for military aid and access to the White House. Democrats make final appeals in a cloudy 2020 Iowa caucus race. Why the Iowa caucuses are so important. Oh, let me erase that. One moment, please. Strike that, reverse it. Protests in the 1960s, a mimeograph machine, and a long shot candidate all contribute to Iowa's unlikely role in the presidential election process. The desire to capture the Big Mo from Iowa has only grown thanks in large part to the Iowa's embrace of being first and the media storm that descends every 4 years. Miss Warren skipped her signature photo lines, explaining regretfully that she needed to get around as much as I need to get around Iowa as much as possible, okay? Her internet famous dog, Bailey, was stepping in to be photographed in her stead. Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, who has been contesting Iowa as a vigorous underdog, implored voters to have my back because she had to return to Washington briefly to attend the impeachment duties Monday. Can Democrats beat Trump in Iowa in November? Is Iowa, with its large rural blue-collar and overwhelmingly white population, the kind of state where the Republican Party that Mr. Trump remade, the kind of state where the Republican Party that Mr. Trump remade is going to dominate as long as he is on the ticket? Or does it offer a glimmer of hope for Democrats to gain voters they lost in 2016, as Mike Hellepis waited to enter the rally at a Des Moines College campus the other night? He predicted the same landslide as Mr. Trump. As Democrats consider which parts of the country and what kinds of voters are most persuadable, they're divided over whether Iowa's swing voters are worth pursuing, compared to others who are more liberal-leaning but didn't show up in 2016. Jeff Link, a Democratic strategist who held focus groups of Obama-Trump supporters, said his party was passing up on a huge opportunity if it ignored the 150,000 Iowans who cast ballots for Mr. Obama and then supported Mr. Trump. Key to Mr. Trump's success is again turning out those pro-Trump voters, many of whom did not vote in 2018 and who live in rural areas where they are more difficult and expensive to reach, in equal or greater numbers than 2016. This is probably the most important thing for all of us, is that the Trump voters that voted in 2016 but sat out 2018 because the president wasn't on top, said Mr. Kaufman. To me, this is a political gold mine. Where do we have? Oh yeah, this one. Stand here for your candidate. Iowans state their preferences in public. Most recently, Mr. Sanders has appeared to open up a lead in Iowa, consolidating liberal backings as more moderate candidates in the race continue to split their support. For the first time, the Iowa Democratic Party will report on a rolling basis 3 numbers on caucus nights: a delegate count, and the amount of support on both the first and second rounds, known as alignments, leaving open the possibility that more than one candidate could claim victory. What if Mr. Sanders receives the most support on the first alignment, but another candidate wins on the delegate count? What if the top candidates are clustered together, separated by only a few percentage points? Such inconclusive results would make it difficult for any candidate to ride unrivaled momentum into New Hampshire 1 week later. A dishonorable Senate. On Friday evening, Republican senators voted in near lockstep to block testimony from any new witnesses or the production of any new documents, a vote that was tantamount to an acquittal of the impeachment charges against President Trump. Its president lost the popular vote by 3 million votes. Mr. Trump is the most corrupt president in modern times, a reality Americans will continue to be reminded of by continuing investigations by the House, which should immediately issue a subpoena to Mr. Bolton, by a trio of cases in the Supreme Court that seek to reveal Mr. Trump's shady finances, and of course, by the behavior of the man himself. The simple reason Trump does what he does. In more than 3 years since the tape emerged, it's become clear that "you can do anything" line wasn't only describing Trump's attitude toward women. No American president before Trump would have dared to collaborate openly with foreign countries for partisan advantage. Obviously, Trump's credo is only half of the impeachment story, because the Senate is supposed to be an independently powerful body, not a political servant to the White House. There's no right way to mourn. If bereaved players are slow to comment publicly, should we call them out? Must everyone who has ever met Bryant say something in public? When people with vastly different lived experiences come together around a public death, there's no real shared understanding of what's appropriate. This is why the grief police wield such power in calling people out. Introducing blame into the grieving process causes people to question whether they are dealing with loss the right way and to feel guilty about what they do, say, and feel. In the age of communal and public mourning, do we grieve and not let the grief police undercut how we feel? How do we continue to perform at our best with heavy hearts? The Exhaustion Caucus. A paper last year in SAGE journals found that people who were experiencing high levels of stress and emotionality when talking about political news now, and they frequently develop mechanisms to cope with high levels of emotionality. The APA's former executive director for professional practice, Dr. Catherine C. Nordell, has advised people, if the 24-hour news cycle is causing you stress, limit your media consumption. She continued, read enough to stay informed, but then plan activities and give yourself a regular break from the issues and the stress they might cause. And remember, take care of yourself and pay attention to other areas of your life. Even as such, Trump is still somewhat inescapable, as fears of Wuhan's coronavirus spread. Rather than rushing out to buy masks and fretting over unlikely chance of contracting the coronavirus, Americans should get their flu shots and wash their hands often to avoid the flu. New York. Racist. The writer is a professor of health policy and management at Mailman School of Public Health, Columbia University. Your article describing the Chinese health system as being feeble in its ability to deal with the coronavirus epidemic in Wuhan depicts an overwhelmed medical infrastructure in China. It's a time to remake our digital lives. Ms. Zuboff warned of the dangers. Ms. Zuboff warned of the dangers of surveillance capitalism. Her solution is for the government to pass new laws limiting the ability of surveillance capitalists to use the data they collect. In a perfect world, this would be a reasonable response. In the real world, with our current government, this is pretty much zero chance of success. Here's another idea. Delete your Facebook account. Use a search engine other than Google. Don't use Gmail. Don't buy anything on Amazon. Don't use Microsoft products. Don't allow Alexa and any other listening device into your home. Don't install anything to make your home smart. And use your smartphone with little discretion and thoughtfulness. These are things each and every one of us can do. There are alternatives to all the products and services provided by the dominant surveillance capitalists. If we as citizens are truly concerned about the loss of our privacy and individual agency, it's time to take a little personal responsibility for our digital lives. You say Americans deserve the freedom to choose a life without surveillance. Quite so. I've exerted that power by the simple expedient of never having acquired a smartphone, averting addiction to such device, saving time for better pursuits than gazing at a tiny screen, and staying out of the vast data set your special section so frighteningly describes. I'm heartsick to read about many Iranians who were denied entry into the United States, despite months of extensive vetting, being accepted for study, investing in airfare, and leaving their jobs and homes. They were abruptly turned away and deported. This is America at its worst, not its best. I lived in Iran for 2 years before the 1979 revolution. I have great love for the Iranian people and great respect for the culture. Very few Americans today have any direct experience with Iran, so it's easy to demonize the country and its people. Neither the United States nor Iran is perfect, but both will gain from person-to-person contact, building toward knowledge and understanding and away from preconceptions and ideology. Surely this is the wisest way to ensure our security. Much of the advice in Jane E. Brody's column is excellent, but some of it is confounding and restrictive. To tell readers, for example, that a perfectly reasonable offer like, hey, call me if you need anything, is unhelpful or off-putting might lead them to say nothing, and that would be a shame. Though I have been sitting with my diagnosis for 4 months, it took me until today when I finally got my first shot and took the first of the pills I will probably take every day for the rest of my life to fully believe that cancer was happening to me. How could I possibly expect my friends and family to respond with the news in a way I find fulfilling when I hardly know how to respond myself? Cancer is terrifying for everyone, and we need to talk about it more, not less. There will be awkward reactions and wonderful ones, so what if some reactions are clumsy? We ought to take time to educate the people we care about and focus on those who surprise us in wonderful ways. Why invent sites where none was intended? He assaulted his girlfriend. Now he wants a political comeback. A judge found Mr. Monserrate guilty of misdemeanor assault for dragging Miss Giraldo. Mr. Monserrate escaped a felony conviction for slicing her face. At another event, Fernando Cabrera, a Democratic City Council member from the Bronx, and at least one other district leader were photographed with Mr. Monserrate and a Hiram 2020 sign. In January, Mr. Monserrate visited a senior center in Corona, in the district where he would run, and handed out cookies to dozens of older guests. Suicide at Hudson Yards vessel. Teenager jumps over railing. A 19-year-old man jumped to his death on Saturday from the vessel, the sculpture that is the centerpiece in the Hudson Yards development, the authorities said. Peter Salkowski of Cold Springs, Kentucky, said that he had seen the body lying on the ground from close to the top of the sculpture Saturday, and that his wife, Marita Salkowski, had called 911. He said that he had spoken to a man who had tried to grab the teenager and stop him from jumping. Brigham Barnes, who had been waiting in line Saturday to enter the vessel with a friend, said the young man fell on the south side of the sculpture, and soon after, Hudson Yards employees put up a small tent blocking the view. A dozen calls to child abuse hotline did not save the 8-year-old boy. The children are frequently hungry, beg for food, and eat food out of garbage, one caller said in March 2019. According to documents, the boy's mother said she had obtained from the statewide Central Register of Child Abuse and Maltreatment. The case, with its documented piles of reports, phone calls, and court filings in which teachers, nurses, school psychologists, advocates, and the Valva boy's mother tried unsuccessfully to raise the alarm about the children's treatment by their father, a veteran transit cop, has turned a harsh light on Suffolk County's Child Protection Agency. In some instances, investigators declared the claims unfounded, documents show. In a few instances, when they were corroborated, the children were still left in their father's home. Coronavirus in New York. 2 more possible cases in city are identified. A day after New York City's health authorities said that a woman hospitalized at Bellevue Hospital Center might have the new coronavirus, the authorities on Sunday announced that a second patient might have the virus. For more than a week, New York City has been bracing for the arrival of the new coronavirus, which is believed to have originated in the Chinese city of Wuhan as isolated cases began to appear elsewhere in the country. American citizens who have been to Hubei province will be taken into mandatory quarantine upon entry into the United States, or directly to a hospital if they are found to be symptomatic. Rick Cotton, the executive director of Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, said on Sunday. A scrappy Iowa startup is the read for political insiders. All attention is on Iowa now. Hundreds of reporters from Washington and New York had descended for the next day's CNN debate, and Mr. Reinhard wanted the site's reporting to stand out. In an interview afterward, Mr. Reinhard said he first imagined starting line as a left-leaning alternative to Iowa's conservative political blogs. The site will cover Iowa's Senate and House races, but 4 of Mr. Reiner's reporters were hired only for the caucus. 2020 Super Bowl commercials. Funeral for Mr. Peanut, tears for Mr. Google. Sabra cast 2 former contestants from RuPaul's Drag Race, Kimchi and Ms. Cracker, making it possible for the first Super Bowl commercial to feature drag queens. Tide, which overran the Super Bowl 2018 with crossover commercials, teamed this year with Bud Light, the upcoming film Wonder Woman 1984, and the Fox show The Masked Singer. Pop-Tarts, which featured the flowing hair of Jonathan Van Ness of Queer Eye in its commercial, called out Hyundai's Boston-accented spot, Smart Talk, by posting on Twitter, Pop-Tarts. In the coming months, the Super Bowl commercials that were rolled out with so much hype will dissolve into the general advertising atmosphere, appearing in the act breaks of sitcoms, police procedures, and reality shows, most likely all but unnoticed. A top L brand executive complained of harassment. Then she was locked out. Mr. Elson, the Delaware professor, said the proper course would have been for Mr. Colott to inform the appropriate board committee and for the board to hire outside counsel to look into the matter. How did Mr. Colott handle her complaint? Instead of his former board colleagues, did he go directly to Mr. Wexner or someone close to him? It's almost inconceivable that Miss Mitro, a senior executive at Mr. Wexner's flagship brand, would have been locked out of the building without his knowledge or approval. 2 people familiar with the board's deliberations said Miss Mitro's complaint did reach the board, but only after Miss Mitro was gone. Jeff Bezos is sued by his girlfriend's brother. Michael Sanchez, a Hollywood talent manager and the brother of Lauren Sanchez, said in his lawsuit, which was filed on Friday in state court in Los Angeles, that Mr. Bezos and Galvin DeBecker, the consultant, had falsely told journalists that he had leaked graphic nude photographs of Mr. Bezos to the Inquirer. In his blog post last year, Mr. Bezos quoted emails sent to Mr. DeBecker's lawyer by an American media lawyer and the company executive who wrote that the photos contained during our news gathering included a nude below-the-belt selfie. American media said in emails that it would refrain from publishing the photos if Mr. Bezos said publicly he believed the expose was not politically motivated. After Mr. Bezos and Ms. Sanchez were guided in their decision to keep the relationship hidden by a psychic in New Mexico. Mr. Sanchez's lawyer wrote Mr. Sanchez was instrumental in covering up first the existence and second the timing of the affair. DIY retirement investors have a low-cost friend, newsletters. Mr. Weiner's tenure at the helm of the newsletter hasn't been free of friction with the company he covers. In 1993, Vanguard sued the newsletter for a trademark infringement in a case that was settled. The newsletter Fidelity Monitor and Insight has a growth model that started in 1986, the longest-running portfolio with a risk-return ratio that's right in the middle of its 5 model portfolios. Jack Bowers, president of Independent Fidelity Investors, the publisher of the newsletter, who has about 18,000 subscribers with an average age of 75, said he consulted with the editors John Boyd and John Bonanzino to determine trades for the 5 model portfolios. Select, unique opportunities, growth and income, income. This week in tech, London hands Washington a loss on Huawei. For weeks, we had been waiting to see whether Prime Minister Boris Johnson would allow Huawei equipment to be used in Britain's 5G wireless network or follow American officials in shutting the company out. Why did Boris Johnson make the decision to allow Huawei to stay involved in building Britain's 5G network, despite all the pressure he was under from the Trump administration? As part of allowing Huawei to be part of the network, British officials years ago required the company to subject its products and code to tests. Your credit card benefits just got cut. What do you do? Many banks beside Chase are truncating or cutting beloved credit card benefits, and many are also raising their credit card annual fees. Pros of downgrading your card. Whether you don't want to cancel your card and lose your line of credit, or you just don't want to forego the points or miles you've accrued, downgrading to another card from the same bank might mean you can keep your existing rewards, as well as your line of credit. Typically, downgrading your card keeps your card number and the account history the same, and it usually won't result in another inquiry of your credit report. That has been Reading the Times for Monday, February 3rd, 2020!